the meeting of the Planning Board. I'd like to begin by first introducing our newest member. Walter Sullivan was appointed unanimously by the Planning Board and by the Board of Selectmen last Thursday night. So I welcome Walter and extend him welcome to the board. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed your Monday night. Just ended with us. All right, tonight we're going to continue the discussion of our master plan. The agenda for this evening from 7 to 8, we're going to discuss economic development and historic preservation. During that hour, I'm going to ask our town planner, Mary Savage Dunn, is going to be the facilitator for that discussion. And then from 8 to 9, we're going to transition for an hour on to recreation open space. And during that time, our friend from MPCA, Joan Blaustein, is going to help us to facilitate during that time. I would encourage everybody in the audience to please participate. This is more about hearing from you than it is hearing from us. The microphone is there for you to speak in. When you come up to the mic, please just identify yourself and your address, but I would encourage you to speak as often as much as you'd like tonight. So with that, then I'm going to turn it over to our facilitator. Mary's going to help us out.
Thank you. I'm actually going to go to the microphone, if that's okay. So good evening and welcome. As the chair said, my name is Mary Savage Dunham, and I'm the Director of Community Planning. And before we get started, I'd like to just frame the dialogue by saying we are working on the master plan update in a segmented version. We're working on a portion of the master plan update in conjunction with MAPC because we were fortunate enough to receive a $60,000 Sustainable Communities grant, and that's why we're working in tandem on the majority of the plan. But then there'll be other forums and dialogues that the planning board is going to get a little deeper into some of the topics and perhaps a little broader dialogue on some issues that matter most to the town of Hingham and to the planning board. And with that, because we're working with the MAPC on their Sustainable Communities grant, I'm going to pass out a brief survey to you, and with any grant comes metrics and accountability. And so this is anonymous, it's not mandatory, but it would be very helpful to us if you could take a minute, fill it out. If some of you have done it already, you don't need to do it again, and thank you for doing it the first time. Please fill it out, fold it in half, and pass it in before you leave. And we're going to just give it right to MAPC to put into the system. That'd be very helpful. This is a different survey. I'm also going to pass out to everyone a copy of the Hingham Master Plan Summary. I know some of you have paperwork, but do you all have this yet this evening? No. Okay, so seeing none, bear with me for 1 minute. I'm going to pass this out to everybody. This is great. Everybody's helping. Thank you very much. So what we're passing around now is a copy of the executive summary from the last update of the master plan done in 2002. And what we want to start to talk about tonight is some of the substantive elements of that plan. And as Mr. Ramsey said, we're going to start out talking about economic development and historic preservation. And really what we're hoping for is a dialogue from you, the community, and let us know what are we doing that's right, what are we not doing that perhaps we should either do or consider doing or have a dialogue about, and what did we say that we're going to do and we've done and it's great and we can move on and kind of that chapter's closed. And to help frame that conversation, I'd like to take a look, and I'm just going to read you some of the goals from the summary to just kind of start the conversation. And under economic development, we had recommendations from the last plan around strengthening local businesses that are beneficial to the community and strengthening our tax base, maintaining high design standards for existing and new commercial development, attracting new businesses that fit the character of the community in terms of both scale, attractiveness, and functionality, and keeping major traffic producing economic development near regional highway areas as opposed to the town center, and promoting aesthetically and fiscally desirable land uses like high-tech office or senior assisted living, and not just encouraging it, but actually seeking it out and trying to draw that type of development into town. There's also a statement that we need to be cognizant that improved infrastructure must accompany commercial growth. Now, interestingly, on the same page under land use, there's other recommendations that kind of sound like they might fit in under economic development. Cluster commercial uses in strategic locations to limit commercial sprawl and strip development, manage growth and future development to limit adverse fiscal impacts, reserve sufficient town-owned land for future facility needs. Now, the map over there on the podium may be a little hard to see, but what jumps out at you are colored parcels. And all of the parcels that are not yellow are land holdings by either the town or an arm of the town, meaning the Board of Ed or the school department or the Conservation Commission. So what you can see looking at that map is the town is now controlling that amount of land. Does Hingham have a need for more? Is that something that we should look at or consider? And for what purposes? Moving over to historic and cultural resources, the recommendations in this executive summary revolve around protecting Hingham's character-defining landscapes from further alteration through land acquisition, land swaps, tax abatements, and the establishment of and purchase of scenic easements. Now, I've had people ask me if the town is looking to identify any other scenic roads. My answer was not at the moment. And, you know, I'm looking for suggestions or information on if that's something that should happen. We've received some comments within the planning department about concerns about the deterioration of the historic center and some of the historic character that really defines Hingham for many, many people. And so is that something that is still an issue or a concern? Does the town need to take more steps to be more protective of certain areas of town at the same time as the town is encouraging growth in other areas? There is a tool that helps provide further protection to historic areas. It's called a historic estate district overlay. The purpose would be to keep original estate-sized lots intact because they're part of the whole historic house, historic vista package of portions of town, and they reflect the era in history when these homes were built. It protects the whole landscape, not just particular properties. Is this something that should be considered, or do we have adequate protections in place? Other recommendations are to provide sufficient resources to adequately staff our historic commissions, and to continue to document and inventory Hingham's historic resources and landscapes, and to focus preservation efforts on areas targeted for significant growth. Now, without reading the whole document to you, I can report to you that there were additional funds provided to support the historic administrator and her position and her role in town. I think this underscores the town's commitment to historic preservation. And I can also report out that the update of the historic inventory is underway now. A consultant is working on that, and that process hopefully will be delivered in December. Are we looking at? So some of the recommendations that are in this report either have been done or are in the process of being done. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is open the floor up for comments and questions and dialogue. And if you're comfortable, you can come up to the podium, and I'd be happy to sit back down. I would just ask you for the TV audience to speak directly into the microphone. Does anyone have any questions or comments, or? Come on up.
Alan Pearl, 2 Anderson Road. I'm the Bathing Beach Trustees and the Harbor Development Committee. I guess I had a question. You had touched on it, Mary, about the downtown area, if it is, because it does come up from time to time, the yellow building, is it the Lincoln building, whatever it is. What realistically can a town do to incentivize? I think our downtown, for the most part, is in pretty good condition, but if you do have a building that I remember I worked on the Greenbush project, and I was inside that building 9 years ago, and it was decrepit then, and you know, it might have got supported by the Greenbush because we actually had to support the foundation, which probably helped keep it up. I guess maybe that was a detriment, but what can realistically a town do? Fortunately, we don't have many of those buildings, but if you get to that, you know, for the aesthetics, and almost every other block looks pretty good but that.
Well, that's a good question, and I guess to incentivize preservation of the facades, there's a number of different tools. Now, Hingham doesn't qualify for some of the federally funded tools that do that, like block grant, those types of programs. So if there were to be some kind of incentive program, it would probably be a combination of some kind of design review and then some other kind of, I don't want to say fund because I'm not quite sure where the money would come from, but sometimes the types of incentives that towns can offer are higher density, maybe parking waivers, or a transfer of development rights from one place to another. Some of those tools that benefit the developer can be helpful. And I'm not saying that those are all applicable to the property in question, per se. But I will state, we have heard a lot of comments about the downtown area and what types of activities should be there. Do we have the right mix of uses there? Are there other uses that we should have there? Should we have more residential development in the downtown area? And so we've had a lot of feedback, you know, at the South Shore Business Coalition meeting about how can the town provide more incentives for bed and breakfasts or for transit-oriented development? Is there an opportunity to provide housing for people aged 25 to 35 in town, either by a transit center or in the downtown area? So these are all topics that are coming up, and you know, how do you feel about that? We'd like to hear from you.
In terms of the Lincoln building, at one point in time, the owner was talking about raising it and building a commercial building that was office-based or retail-based. And I'm wondering, the top 2 floors, I understand, are no longer habitable or no longer on an occupancy permit. I believe they can only use the first floor. Is that true?
No. I'm not certain.
No.
It's not, I mean, I know they use the second floor.
The second floor is...
But I don't know what the legal status of any of it is.
I can check.
I think the reason they couldn't raise it, Gary, if I remember correctly, was with the Greenbush, if they raised it and built a new one, they could have no windows in the back because of the Greenbush. So that was the reason he sort of put a stop on that. That's what I remember.
If one were to consider that as an opportunity for housing on the upper levels, mixed use, as you were saying, uses for the downtown office, I mean the downtown master plan, the overlay plan, what would be the impediments that would have to be overcome? Is parking an issue there? Is setback? I mean, it's an existing building. What are the impediments to developing that property?
I have not walked through the property myself, so I will say that right up front. It is an existing structure, so the setbacks don't come into play as long as it's not expanded. And, you know, typically impediments for housing in the downtown area are access to parking or access to transit. And, you know, it's hard for people to live someplace if they can't get to where they need to work unless they work right in that area. So I would say that would be, you know, a big impediment. Then I would also say, depending on how old the building is, there's different building codes about requiring sprinklers and wood-framed buildings, and sometimes that can get very, very costly very quickly when you want to add residential in. So there could be some of that, especially in a town like Hingham.
But I think going back to Alan Peralt's question is, how do you engage the property owner? And I think that's something that we need to think long and hard about, because we have a downtown overlay district that has eased the parking requirements, that allows for leasing parking off-site. That building, unfortunately, has lost the grandfathered parking spaces for its 3rd floor, from my understanding. I'm not sure. But how do we engage the property owner, who also owns a number of other properties in the downtown area? Because we certainly can't do the work for them.
And I certainly could, if the planning board, if that was your your will, certainly I'm happy to engage in dialogue. I'm here to work with any property owner who wants help or guidance or even just a dialogue about their property.
I mean, it seems that that would be a good idea to see what we could do to get that started.
Very good. Andrea?
Hi, Andrea Young, 597 Main Street in Hingham, and I'm the administrator for the Historical Commission and the Historic Districts Commissions. With respect to the Lincoln Building, there are tax credit programs available, but the only thing is that the owner has to be willing to restore the building and rehabilitate it. It could be adaptive reuse, but nevertheless, that is the purpose of the historic tax credit. It's a federal program. So that is available. The other thing I wanted to say with respect to downtown, I think we've got a wonderful downtown. But I have found over the years that it is less, less strollable, let's put it that way. I think that we have allowed a lot of businesses on the first floor. These are not things that draw people into Hingham. And in terms of, people come, to go to shops. We have wonderful restaurants, so that's a plus. But people like to just come on a Saturday and walk around and shop. What would be nice also is, I agree with the idea of having mixed use in terms of having apartments, people who can live in town, so that the, we can bring some economic vitality into downtown Hingham. There are many historic buildings in downtown, and I think one of our challenges, and Mary and I saw this with a prospective business owner who decided, obviously, against renting the building or purchasing it, that sometimes people find it difficult to imagine how they could possibly work with an historic building and yet have an adequate storefront. But that's been done in other towns very successfully. Whether it's Alexandria, Virginia, or whether it's Newburyport or Portsmouth. I mean, this is very common. So I think that whatever we can do to encourage people to take advantage of our historic buildings it's sustainable development. Thank you.
Good evening. Ben Wilcox, 6 Green Street. I'd like to address downtown in a larger area. Maybe we'll call it Greater Downtown, West Hingham to the waterfront to Hingham Center. And rather than just focusing on 53 South Street, how that affects all the buildings downtown. So the big driver downtown, as far as what the desire is mixed use. Years ago, we tried to pigeonhole zoning, and downtown was for business only. It has never really worked. Second floor offices go vacant all the time. There's a large demand for the few rentals that are down there. So the disincentives we have for residential use on the buildings, our current bylaw, there's no waivers allowed for residential use. It's only for business use. Under Selectmen's rule, there's no overnight parking. So even if you did have a waiver, you can't park in the street overnight. We do have an exception for leased parking. That's risky for an owner to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in putting in apartments, only to find out his lease would expire in his parking area and the apartments become condemned. Those are the major zoning issues downtown. The other ones are just the concept of making that change seems to have caused trouble over the years. when we tried to just get overnight parking for the existing apartments, the DPW was opposed to it, other groups were opposed to it. And I think we have to include the desires of the whole town in this master plan so we can show it to all the departments and let them know that is the desire for the whole town, so we can get everyone else on board with that. I think those are the biggest disincentives.
I know that there are people who live in apartments downtown who park on the street overnight all year long. It doesn't seem to be enforced.
They enforce it in the winter?
Yeah,
Quite often.
yeah. So maybe it's a matter of getting that conversation going.
Is it the restriction during winter months?
It's year-round.
Is it, I thought it was like, my understanding was it was from like October to April or some, it's obviously snow season, but.
Yes, I mean, it's a regulation put out by the selectmen. No overnight parking townwide, year-round. There's no exceptions to it. It's just that usually the phone calls come from the DPW. They can't plow, they can't sweep the streets, and that's how it gets enforced. Sometimes you'll see the rookie police officers put on beat downtown, and they're just following the bylaw, and they'll run down and hand out tickets. But it is townwide. We did get an exception for the north side of South Street, in between Main and North, for resident overnight parking, and that worked out. It was only a one-year exception. However, people have been parking there for a few years now without any trouble, so it did work in that one spot.
I think Jim had his hand up first.
I just want to say something quick on Ben's point. It makes sense.
You need to come to the microphone.
Not that we want to be the city of Boston or something, but would it make sense on something like that to have a parking permit specific to somebody who lives in the downtown? Wouldn't it be simple to have like a mechanism?
Like a sticker. or
Yeah, a
something.
sticker. So if I lived on North Street or South Street, you have to be a defined area, and you got to show a lease or I own something. And I would tend to think that then you could have a situation where you do that. And again, they're going to have to have a place during snowstorms, no different than the city of Boston, where snow comes and you have to be off the street, and you maybe work out some of the CVS parking lots. But Lucy's saying, well, they park there. Well, that's privately owned. But if you are going to be in a building on South Street or North Street or whatever, I would tend to think that would be a reasonable solution.
And I think you could probably move a vehicle down to Station Street. And I don't think there are restrictions down there.
There
So
aren't.
if somebody was in an apartment, let's say, in the area like Ben was talking about, they could always move their car down there during snowstorms. You don't leave like maybe half-mile walk, if that.
You're looking at those two regulations? One of the exceptions I spoke about on not having waivers for apartments, there was the exception if you have leased parking. Also, our current bylaw allows, if the selectmen choose to adopt a permit process, you can use that as part of your waiver. So that would work. Also, our regular bylaw allows parking on Station Street, because they don't consider that a way, so overnight parking is allowed. Also, our bylaw allows the DPW to tow vehicles not to a private garage, but they can tow it to any public parking lot, which would severely reduce the amount of impact on someone that was towed. So just the cost of the ticket would cover the towing if it was necessary.
Oh, Jim had his hand up for a while back there.
Jim Watson, 291 Rockland Street. I think there's been a lot of stuff in the planners literature recently, and there's a thing called Planners Network, which is an internet where people ask questions and answer them. And a lot of the discussion lately has been about obstructions to upstairs living in downtown areas. And the consensus has been that mandating parking, which is physically impossible, is the biggest problem. And the answers are off-site leases, off-site buildings, various off-site solutions, which we've tried. And I know Ben is much more in touch with the regulations. But I think another point is that the essence of a downtown is the non-residential business aspect. And it's fine to use some upstairs space for housing if it's otherwise vacant, but I don't think it should become the big objective. And where it works out, it works out. Over the CVS building, those former offices became apartments. And I guess I think they're all apartments, I know some are. And no harm in that, but I'd rather see more things like the Hingham Journal is upstairs in the Journal building, which wouldn't work for the handicap, but at least it's using the space in an historic building. So my only main point is I think that first focus should be strengthening the non-residential aspects. And part of the charm is the contiguity. You go by Brigham's or Patsy's, and the buildings, continuous frontage. It's very strollable. You park behind. You go around the corner to where the old Texaco station was, between the community center and CVS, and there's this great void. Well, it's very useful parking. It's de facto parking that probably gets used by more than CVS people. But it's also quite a hole in terms of the strollable downtown. And across the street, there's a very pretty park that I think Mary Smith designed between Walsh and Packard and the pumping station. And it's very nice in itself. But again, it's a dead spot in terms of walking along store by store, window by window. So I think one thing to look at is ways in the long run to try to encourage the filling in of those areas with commercial space. And can somebody comment on what happened with the provisions about no downstairs real estate offices, or not too many real estate offices, or only nice real estate offices? I totally forget what came of that, but there was a real concern about trying not to get too many deadening uses. I think it looks as though you know something about it.
I think we all know a lot about it because we did pass a change to the zoning bylaw 2 years ago to the downtown overlay district, which required a special permit to go from retail use to an office use in a first floor space in the downtown overlay district. And there are specific criteria enumerated for that special permit, and there are something along the lines of, if the space is away from the street, if it's physically not conducive to retail. There's a couple of other provisions, and that has passed. However, it's really a little bit of a judgment call, and the ZBA did recently give someone a special permit to have an office on the ground floor. So.
Beth Rockoff, 36 Pleasant Street. I wondered if you could address, possibly for the purpose of preservation and like the Lincoln Building in town, whether the planning board would be interested in putting something forward. There is some rules on demolition by neglect, so that there are consequences of letting a building fall to such disrepair so that you don't have uninhabitable facilities, and whether there's ways to put something forward with the planning, as well as I know you, the planning board, put together sizes of lots that in consequences for the size of the bedroom, but still the houses can become huge. And if there was a way to put some kind of ruling forward that would be coverage of lots so that we don't lose all of our open space, so that you're not just having a very small lot with a big mansion on it and no more open space and no more trees, and whether the planning board would maybe put some kind of a zoning restriction in to prevent what's happening. And at one of the most recent meetings that the Historic Commission put forward, there was some talk of other areas that have some tax benefits for preserving rather than demolishing things. And that might help to preserve the aesthetics and the historic aspects that we have in town that a lot of times now people just want to destroy and demolish. And we have a 6-month bylaw, but people are just waiting it out. And so we need to have some kind of regulations within the town to help maintain the historic aspect, because once it's gone, there's nothing left. And I don't know how you guys feel about that.
Relative to the second point, Beth, a couple of years ago, was it 2 or 3 years ago, a zoning bylaw amendment was put forth to put some dimensional controls in the residential dimensional use and use table in the bylaw, and it didn't pass at that town meeting. But it seems to me in looking at, there's a couple of items here that we might connect. One of the reasons to save some of the older houses in the town is to preserve some of the affordable houses that are in the town, because a smaller house, if it's purchased for the value of the land for development of a larger house, then chances are that smaller house won't survive, at least after the 6-month demolition delay bylaw expires. You know, that time frame expires, and the house might be gone. So I was thinking, is there a way we could make a connection between dimensional controls, a floor area ratio requirement, which would say, which a lot of towns do, most cities do, but a lot of towns do it too, where it'd say that, you know, you might have a .25 designation, so if a lot's 10,000 square feet, you could build a 2,500 square foot house on it. We might look at something like that, because it might help us to preserve some of the affordable older houses, which are opportunities for some affordability. We might connect that. I think there was resistance. This came on the heels of a further discussion on the Hatfield Amendment, which was done 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I can't remember exactly when it was done. And the issue was the level of control of a private property owners, you know, how they use their property. And it was something that didn't pass town meeting. But maybe it's time to look at it again, because there might be an opportunity.
More like 6 years ago, I think.
Was it 6 years ago?
I mean, I'm guessing, but.
Yeah, I just thought it might be an opportunity. In terms of, I don't know what other towns are doing in terms of preservation incentives relative to tax law. What are other towns doing in terms of preservation enhancements or relative to tax laws and or tax incentives?
Well, there is
Come to the microphone, yeah.
Thank you. Could you come up to the mic so we can get people on, all people watching on TV? Thank you.
There is available tax credits for facade easements. In other words, preserve the facade of your house. They've been very controversial everywhere. We tried to look at it in this town, and it was pretty much thought as a negative rather than a positive. It tends to get abused, but it is a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
This one, Andrea Young. I just wanted to add to what Ben was saying because I think the town of Arlington has a tax incentive in place for people who restore their houses. And so I think perhaps we can take a look at that. The other thing I wanted to say is that I've referenced the master plan, the previous master plan and the current one, numerous times as I've tried to sell one thing or another with respect to historic resources, and it's been very helpful. The Historical and Historic Districts Commission have done a number of the things, have accomplished a number of the things that were recommended in the previous master plan. However, I would really like to see support for extending. There are a couple of areas of town where we really could benefit by extending our historic districts, and there is a lot of literature out there that talks about how historic districts do help maintain the value of properties and contribute to the bond rating, essentially. I mean, they're very stabilizing. So there are a couple of areas that we would like to see and would appreciate support to do. One is going up Main Street to finish up Liberty Plain, and the other is there's a phase 3 for the Hingham Center District that goes down East Street, and that's a possibility, and then also going up Summer Street right past Tom's house. So those are a couple of things that I think would be helpful to look at.
And Andrea, could you explain
Yes.
to the board what you see as a benefit for extending these districts? Are these protecting gateways or just resources or vistas?
Well, I think for the Liberty Plain Historic District, and then one of the other things that it was probably about a year and a half ago now that I think, Judy, you probably don't even remember because I didn't remember it until lately. I had seen something with respect to a gateway overlay district. And Queen Anne's Corner would be a perfect place for that, so that we could control what is going up there. I think, you know, we're lucky we've got some very cooperative property owners in town, you know, who value restoration. But you can't always count on that, and so to have incentives like that in place, or regulation is really the better word, for all of our gateways into town. So that's one thing. And, you know, ideally also, you know, when an historic district is formed, it's a very lengthy process. It takes about a year to do because it's talking to the people involved, the people who are going to be affected by being included in a district, explaining to them that, you know, the regulation is, you know, what the guidelines are, what the regulations are. And so and there are a series of public meetings and all sorts of literature. And when we extended the Hingham Center Historic District for the Phase 2 area, which included Levitt Street and Spring and Pleasant and School, that took a good year, and it was a great process. I think out of the 88 properties, there were probably two property owners who expressed concern. So, but it does help us maintain our resources, and it brings to light the importance of the history of the town in those areas, because any historic district has to be documented. There has to be a clear rationale for putting one forward. And so, again, I think, you know, it's an investment in our resources. Thanks.
Lucy Hancock, 15 Amber Road. I may have missed it in the 2002 plan document, but I didn't see a lot of mention of the waterfront and bathing beach. And I know Alan is here, but I think if we're going to look at our economic development in the downtown area, we need to continue to focus on the link to the waterfront and the issues with 3A and the current plans for the bathing beach. And I think it's not just economic, it's open space, it's recreation. And I'd just like to see if there's comments about that as to how we can do more to link those two areas, the downtown and the waterfront.
Alan, do you want to come up? If you don't mind, we can.
Yes, we've been talking about that a fair amount in the last few years, obviously, and 3A being, as Lucy pointed out, the major impediment. And I think you're probably also aware that there is some talk now of looking at the Rotary. It's been looked at before, but I think if the people who live down by Steamboat Lane and up on Summer Street have witnessed a number of really tough accidents there. And there was a meeting with the state Mass Highway Department. There was a meeting about that Mary was at. It was about 2.5 weeks ago, I think, Mary. And they had 6 or 7 people there from the state. It was fairly impressive. And they actually had a video camera showing where you're going down the road. So it was like you were in the passenger seat. In fact, when you were going by the Sovereign Bank, you had an inclination to put your foot on the brake, you know. So it was very realistic. But I mean, I think that's what it highlights is, like Lucy's talking about, is, you know, the disconnect. In fact, when I first went on the planning board before I was on with Sarah, I said, you know, boy, if you could ever do anything about making that more passable, and here we are however many years later. That's
and
still...
the PWIT grant, I mean, that was a big purpose of the PWIT grant. Is
correct. So I think some of the thought is if you could while we're doing things on the water, and hopefully we can do a boardwalk and Mary's already talked about trying to integrate the harbor master plan into the master plan, which I think is logical, so it's not an island. And I think we're starting to make some headway, which we're going to hopefully put out the snack shop, the bathhouse for a snack shop. We're hoping that RFP goes out this fall, so maybe this time next year that's actually restrooms are open more than at high tide during the summer, which would be a good thing. And maybe doing some stabilization of the parking lot and the bathing beach, which is a precursor to doing the boat ramp, because Marine Fisheries won't give you any money for a boat ramp unless you have a beach management plan. It's kind of a catch-22 with a lot of these grants. But it still gets back to Lucy's point of, like, how do you get from one to the other, you know, and 3A being the major impediment. I think if you ever could signalize, remove the rotary, or even if you had to downsize it to a roundabout, I think I scaled it off once, it's something like 165 feet across. It's almost half the distance of a football field from telephone building to the what little sidewalk there is. If you're going to Lincoln Maritime, the sidewalk is maybe 3 feet. I don't think it even meets handicap requirements. And there's a guardrail and there's some space on the other side of it. Again, kind of a poor spacing thing. But if you ever could get rid of that and signalize the light, and you, heaven forbid, actually had them all timed, so you actually had a sequence thing, which I always use Quincy Shore Drive as an example, which many of us drive. And during peak hours, it's allowed that you can pretty much go through and the lights blink and it doesn't stop often. But once you get to about 9 o'clock or 9:30, until about 3 or 3:30 or 4, it regularly has pedestrians, you know, stops, all timed equally. So you time it right, you can kind of go through, but if not, you're going to stop. And guess what? There's still the same number of cars that go there as, I think the traffic count is every bit as high as it is on 3A. So it can be done. But I think it's going to take a real concerted effort of the planning board. I think it's a benefit one of your predecessors is on the Board of Selectmen, so I think he's going to have more of an understanding of traffic and transportation issues than the selectmen have had before. But I think it's going to take a concerted effort of a lot of groups to look at that. And I think it's the only thing that's going to allow you to get from point A to point B. You can do stuff along the water, you can, you know, you can do underground utilities, you know, in the square to beautify that. But do you go from one to the other? Typically people kind of don't. You know, you don't want people just driving to the waterfront. You know, they go for the farmer's market, and hopefully they'll go to the snack shop or something, or Red Eye Roasters, but they tend not to cross from one to the other. You know, and I think that's a very good point Lucy made. How do you deal with that issue? And the state is reluctant to do it. I mean, they're very reluctant to change. You know, and they're going to say, well, it's a through road. I mean, it's people going to Situate, Cohasset, and Hull, and you have to move the traffic along. But it has been done elsewhere. So I think we have to be stubborn about it and really be a concerted effort of the different boards that have some say on that to say it's an important thing for this town to address that issue. And not
Who's leading that?
The selectmen have been pretty good about pushing. The MAPC is actually going to be doing some work. Mass Highway at least is looking at it. So I think it got deferred. It was on the, if not the front burner, close to the front burner a couple of years ago, then South Hingham took precedence over it. But I think it now has the right amount of momentum between residents and I think elected officials that this may be the window we have to look at this. Yeah. And I think given that the harbor is now getting a little more recognition and we're trying to do a few things of, I don't want to call it development. In fact, somebody said what a misnomer, the Harbor Development Committee. I mean, but it really should be the harbor. It's kind of an open space asset for the most part. You have 3 private parcels that don't add up to half an acre. So there's really not going to be development per se, but linking our downtown to our business district, it should really be a priority. You know,
Ted's assigned me to the project, so
okay. Got the right person on it.
Very involved.
Yeah. I would just say that in the last 6 or 7 years, we've made a lot of progress in this regard.
Yep.
If you just think about the mobile station acquisition, the farmer's market, you know, rezoning that parcel so that the farmer's market is legally there, the Red Eye Roaster and the parking.
It's an accessory use,
and the
yeah.
CPC funding for Whitney Wharf.
The CPC funding
yeah.
for Whitney Wharf. And you are now on the bathing beach and trying to get that snack shop in down there, and we did the rezoning. So I do feel like we've put a lot in place that now makes this a logical next step, and that doing this work on the roadway would not have made sense if we didn't have at least the start of economic.
Oh, no, I agree. I mean, some people in my committee get frustrated by how slow the process is, that, you know, something went from a plan like 7 or 8 years ago, and most of these things are in the master plan that was done on the harbor in whatever it was, 2007 or 5 or something like that. I mean, the pedestrian bridge was in there, the snack shop was in there, the boardwalk was in there. So they are closer, and the idea of accessory uses was there. But you're right, Judy, it takes a while. But I try to remind our committee that I said 2 or 3 things have gone to town meeting, and generally, if not universal acceptance, have been vast majorities have supported them. So there really is a consensus to do it. It's just a matter of all of us to stay on it, I think, to get it implemented.
Right.
In the current thinking on the connections, the pedestrian connection, is the thinking to provide a safer, like a neck down or a pedestrian connection at Stars, at that island going over to the walkway, and then another one and reducing the Rotary to like a T-shaped intersection, providing another safe pedestrian connection there? And then, would you then have a pedestrian connection all along the waterfront on these open space parcels? Is that basically the plan?
That is the idea, Gary, for the most part. It's certainly the Harborwalk. It's about 0.8 of a mile if you started at the bathing beach and you go to Steamboat Wharf. And if we're hoping that we're going to try to get some grant funds this year to help stabilize the parking lot. We're actually talking, we've worked with Mary and Abby Pearsall on this, of actually cutting back the parking lot at the bathing beach, which isn't very efficient the way it's laid out. And we'll be coming to this board to talk about it, because it would be a reconfigure of the parking space, but you wouldn't lose any. If anyone has been down the bathing beach, the first row of parking has a gap of about 40 feet behind it, because it just doesn't lay out efficiently. You could sacrifice 15 feet of parking lot and then have the same amount of parking spaces. And the thought would be to stabilize the parking lot at that point with some sort of retaining structure, but then beach and public access in front of it. So you'd actually have more resource area. But we think if we could have, it hopefully would be eligible for funding through some of the emergency funds that have come about of it, the bad storms we had last winter. But our thought is if we can get that done, it's a start of this concept. I think if you first got a boardwalk or something like that started, or Harborwalk, there would be a lot of impetus on your point, Judy, to continue it on. Because then even if people go off committees or whatever, other people say, well, that's a good thing to kind of continue that. And you're right, Gary, where do you cross? The meeting we had like a couple of weeks ago, Dick Cook was there and said, everyone's always talked about an overpass over 3A. I mean, I bet everyone's heard that concept. But then you have the access question of like, how do you do handicap access at grade? But he said, don't discount the idea, this is an aside, but I think it's an interesting one, of that most of your parking is at Station Street. And that if you actually did something down at that end, you may have enough physical land that you might be able to do something of that. Again, a little bit of a forward idea, but worth exploring. Like, where should those key points be to cross? And hopefully, and I know Ben's group, when he was with the downtown group, had looked at a reconfiguration of the North Street intersection to tee that off. That free right-hand turn is, you're almost like a kamikaze if you want to walk across that, because people's inclination is to look a little bit to the left and go. So if anyone's trying to walk in that area, you have to go from one spot to another, it's the least encouraging thing to do. So I think it's an excellent point. Where do you do it? Where can you do it safely?
Because I think the perception of the dangerousness of crossing anywhere there is paramount. When you can compare it to crossing over at Nantasket Beach, for example. It's the same traffic, same speed, but it doesn't feel as dangerous. And I don't know whether it's because you've got a good starting point or whether you're on an island, it's safe. But there's something about the transition that feels very dangerous, and I'm thinking, is that contributing to why people aren't using it?
Yeah, I think that's it. That's straighter, for one. I think you also have some sight distance issues, and when we were seeing that video, that became much more evident to me, that a lot of them are sight distance issues, and people coming off the Rotary and accelerating off the Rotary. And even at Stars, there's a little bit of a jog there. I tell the anecdote, the first day I went on the Harbor Development Committee 5 years ago, I decided I'm going to walk the whole area. And I was down by the signal control box, and I was looking over at Stars, and a young boy, man of about 13 years old, asked if I needed help getting across the street, because I think his inclination was, this guy really is going to have trouble maneuvering this, And I think, but that's the point. I mean, if a 13-year-old kid gets it, that's so difficult. I mean, it is.
It is, yeah.
We should be able to do it. I mean, Quincy Shore Drive is a higher volume traffic,
big time
wise, but there's like triple the pedestrian traffic there, and people move across that traffic very, very easily and very safely. So if they're able to do it with a divided highway with that volume of traffic, people coming in and out of Boston on that road, you should be able to do it on 3A. probably the most logical point is the one at Stars.
Yeah, and I think you look at where major roads, obviously where North Street comes in and hits 3A, where Water Street hits 3A, and then you got Ship Street hitting it. I mean, if you're coming from a neighborhood, let's say, and we want to get people from neighborhoods there, they should be able to go down the physically closest street and cross at that point, without having to go down like 4 or 5 blocks to cross at what's, you know, and not that any of them are great right now. I don't know if I could say what is an excellent spot to cross the rail. I don't think there is one. I mean, there's a signalized one, but it's...
Stars is where I would cross. Right?
Yeah, but it's...
It's tough if you have a stroller, you know,
Right.
once you get on the other side, that you say the signal box, the bridge.
It's very difficult.
It's tough,
Yeah. So, I mean, I agree with Judy's point that I think there's more people interested in the concept, but we got to be diligent about pushing it, because it's, you know, it's going to be easy for the state to say, we can't do it, you know, that, you know, we've got to move cars through, and if you slow them down, they'll go down Beale Street, or they'll do this, and it'll be a reason why you can't do it, you know. And
I think Quincy Shore Drive is a great example, as, you know, if they can do it, we can do.
Absolutely. You know, they have all the traffic, if not more, you know, and, okay, so it gets timed, like I said, at peak times, but I think people going are not generally going at rush hour. Right. If a mother's going, she's probably waiting until after, you know, if she's got young kids, you know, the older kids are in school, and you're going down there then, you know, so, and I think people would become aware of when it's more accessible than it wasn't, you know, I think people would quickly get that.
Right.
You know, so.
One other question that I've had on the, looking at approaching the waterfront from the water. And let's say you're in, there used to be when we had the Chandlerly there, you know, and if you wanted something, you had a reason, a destination point to come in from the water if you were over in Hull, or if you were in Hingham Bay, or, you know, just sailing around. It was a nice place to come in at the end of the day, or at lunch. And I was wondering, is there any thought to a restaurant? I'm thinking something like Jake's. Is there any thought to that kind of an activity on the waterfront? Not on the waterfront.
It's hard as a primary use, because you have to have some sort of maritime dependency. Accessory uses are allowed. I mean, arguably, they have them in Boston, you know, and they are public spaces, I suppose, as far as that goes. But you only have 3 private parcels. So you have, you know, 3 Otis Street, you have the Gallery 360 for Lucas's property, and then the and the marina, you know, the other marina that Dana and John run. So the question is, where do you physically do it, I guess? And then how do you meet parking requirements? And now we probably get more turning movements going on the water side, whereas most of them tend to be on the land side. I mean, I don't disagree with you. It would be kind of a destination. We've talked about the idea of how do you get transient boaters to come in and maybe go somewhere. And again, if you ease the connection across to our restaurants, and I think at the town pier we have a couple slips where you could pull into that you may want to go to Tosca Cafe or Stars or something or other. Other towns are better at that. They do little flyers. And I know, Judy, you probably worked on some of that with the downtown group. But, you know, if you could get a link and it was safer to get across, it would make sense for the downtown group to try to, you know, push the water side. Look, you can get here by water, you know, and we're right in Boston Inner Harbor, actually, so you're right, there's a lot of places that could get there. And that's what a lot of boaters do. You go from point A to point B, probably get something to eat, you know. So,
if you could stop traffic before you get to Stars and have that whole Stars section, you know, you could move across. I don't know, I just, you know, the width of it, I don't know, I just get intimidated by sort of having to whip across, but if you had a wider area, that might make it easier. And as you say, more points of crossing potential.
Yeah, well, I think they've talked about the idea, and it was raised, as Mary can say, with that meeting, is could you go 1 lane in each direction? Because it is by the lobster pond. It's 1 lane. Right. And it kind of reverts to 2. And that would allow you to have turnoffs if you did it. Again, that would be a real hard sell with Mass Highway, but they point out part of the reason that people coming to the Rotary, it's so hectic and they pick up speed, is let's say they may want to go down North Street or something like that, or they cut off Water Street. They come through really quickly, and let's say they're in the right-hand lane outside in the Rotary, they jump quickly to the inside lane so they can take a left, and what is a through lane in a left turn lane. If you came into a single lane there and you had turning lanes, I mean, Derby Street to me is a good example of how it works a whole lot better now. Or certainly, it's not perfect, but you look at the volume that goes through compared to what the whole Froma Plaza was. I mean, I have a lot of faith in traffic engineers, the fact of improving a situation with more volume as much as you can. There are limitations to it, but you would think if there's turning movements that allowed that, then through traffic could go. And maybe if you shrunk that down, Sarah, maybe you got a shot of getting a little And maybe we sacrifice, if we do the pedestrian bridge, you might even be able to sacrifice that section of sidewalk over there, because the pedestrian access is over the pedestrian bridge. So, and that's one of the choke points, you know, so even though it's tight now, it could be, that could account for a left-hand turning lane, but still less pavement. I mean, Ben may want to speak to this issue because he knows that whole North Street reconfiguration a lot better than I do. But I thought that was a very viable idea myself, of teeing that off too. You know, they'll say it's going to back out. If it backs up, people go down Beale Street, but I don't know. I'm not sure that that's the answer, you know.
Another question I have on the harbor is rebuilding the boat ramp, like to the quality of the Weymouth ramp, would that be a help to Hingham Harbor, or would it be a hindrance?
I think it would be a help. I mean, right now we have there's almost no place to, let's say you're launching a boat on your own, you know. Our harbor's a tough place to do it because you don't have any place to put your boat if you do launch it, you know. So as you know, they've got the little float that goes beside it. Right. It's a beautiful ramp, and the state funded that. The one in Situate's very nice too, in Situate Harbor. Yeah. And I think it would make some sense to have like a small little dock beside it. So let's say I launch it, I tie my boat up, I go pull my trailer out of the way. Supposedly you're supposed to be able to launch, you know, 2 boats at a time. I mean, and the drop-off is great, and at certain tides you can't do it. So I do think that should be our goal, is something that they've got a little better tide situation than we do. I think it goes a little bit deeper, but nonetheless, you're right. Our goal should be to have something on those lines. And they're going to look at it on the plus side. The reason they would fund it, the state, is because it isn't restricted. We got some money for that parking lot, so it's not restricted. It's not to just Hingham residents. But Hingham residents are the ones who are closest to it. But I think it's why we could get funding, because it's access to Boston Harbor is one of the best ramps in the state, as far as, you know, easy access for somebody to get a boat into the inner harbor.
So I just wanted to get the word in our hour of economic development here. I just wanted to see if there were people here who had ideas for types of uses that they would like to see in Hingham, particularly in South Hingham. When you get off at Derby Street, there's 75 acres there of empty space, which will probably be developed in the near future. And I think this would be a great opportunity for anybody who says, oh gosh, this town could really use to speak up about that, or, you know, or uses downtown that you think that we need that aren't there right now. But I'd love to, if anybody has any ideas or suggestions.
Bob Curley, 1 Gristmill Lane, Vice Chair of the CPC. I actually brought for you this evening some preliminary results from a survey that the CPC is doing that addresses many of the issues that we've been talking about tonight and have on your agenda. Have in mind that this survey is open until September 1st, so
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
and this doesn't go directly to your last question, Judy, but it does address the more broad question of overall issues in the town. Now, the presentation of this data on this bar graph is kind of done backwards. The shorter lines are the ones that indicate the higher expression of importance. And the lower number in the right-hand column indicates the greater importance. So that with respect to the last topic, the people responding to date have placed the highest importance on preserving waterfront access and scenic water views, which I think would speak to having restaurants with that type of economic development across the road from the harbor and expanding water views along the harbor as much as possible. The next items are preserving open space and landscapes and providing paths or protecting the town's water supply, basically came in tied for second, followed by protecting and preserving historic structures, cemeteries, and monuments. So So with the changes to the CPA in the last year that now allows for recreational projects, that will permit things like construction of paths on conservation land, and conceivably can open up to more public use the substantial conservation lands that Hingham has. I personally would think that with respect to your question about development in the Derby Street area, that would seem to lend itself to business, commercial, industrial development. It's close to the roads, and it's where the rest of that is located in the town. To the extent that it doesn't have an impact on water supply because of proximity to a court pond, that would seem to be the way to go as long as it's done in the correct way. So I just wanted to share that data with you. If you have any questions from the perspective of the CPC, happy to try to address them. Thank you.
Mary, I was just wondering, are there ways we can tie their survey into the master plan? I don't know.
Yes, we can certainly tie their survey into the master plan. And since you're talking about surveys, the master plan committee also has a survey online, and our survey period ends June 28th. And I do have cards here that have the link on them for you. And there's also a link from the community planning main page. I would encourage everybody to go before June 28th, and please make your opinions heard and participate in our survey, because we need as much input from as many people as possible. So please help us capture your information, and we will fold in this information as well as the data from the Senior Center survey.
Evening. Tom Wilson, 88 Summer Street, Chairman of the Historical Commission. Beth alluded to our demolition delay bylaw, which I think you're all pretty familiar with, and we did amend it this past year, giving a better description of what demolition was, and it gave us a lot more flexibility in terms of negotiating a compromise with homeowners that want to demolish all or portion of their property. But at the end of the day, after 6 months, in a short 6 months, they can wait us out and do what they want with their property. And there's always this balance between individual property rights and the public good or preserving history. But there's a lot of towns around Massachusetts that have a 12-month and even an 18-month demolition delay. And it's my belief, and I think most of us on the commission believe that I think we should have some serious dialogue now about extending the 6 months to 12 months to give us a little more weight, a little more power, a little more time to negotiate something that would prevent a home. Again, somebody mentioned that once it's torn down, you can never bring it back. It's gone forever. So we think that would be a good idea in the coming months or years to start thinking seriously about extending that demolition delay.
It would be interesting to know in that process what other towns experience, you know, if they've tracked
Yes.
kind of what the results of that increase in time have been, because I think one thing that I'm always conscious of on the planning board is not stalling people just for the sake of stalling them.
Yes.
You know, so if something substantive is going to happen during that time period, terrific. But just to make the process harder doesn't.
No, that is a good point.
A goal.
And we did have a list of all the towns and what their length is. And our next step is we should do some research to determine exactly what the impact is.
Right.
I mean, are there more negotiated resolutions by extending it? Give more time. Or in some cases, a buyer comes up, and instead of destroying an old house, somebody will, or maybe even move it into the old ordinary, you know, something like that. So creative things do occur when there's more time to do them. So
I think one of the towns, the case study that I might suggest is Arlington. Arlington had a 6-month, they went to a 12, and they went to it because of the potential of losing 2 significant houses. And I think as part of that process, they developed a really nice, proactive, which Hingham does too, working with the owner of the property to try to find an appropriate use. And so it is a proactive process.
Yeah.
It isn't just waiting it out. It's I would look at Arlington's, because they really did some incredible things with theirs.
Good idea. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
We're about an hour in the discussion. It's a good discussion. Does anybody want to offer any last comments? Okay, so why don't we take Andrea and Ben? Sure.
Andrea Young. I just wanted to respond to Judy's concern. When a house or a property, whatever it is, a building, has to meet certain criteria in order to be considered historically significant, so that it is not just a delay for just holding people up. So we're very conscious about that, and the demolition delay spells the criteria out, and I also have to justify it with a report to the Mass Historical Commission annually. So.
Ben Wilcox again. A lot of towns have used demolition delay bylaws as a disincentive to tearing buildings down, especially historic ones. One town has what they call historic incentive zoning. One of the reasons you tear a building down is because to solve zoning problems. I think it's historic incentive zoning allows zoning relief if you preserve the house. Last year, we changed our non-conforming bylaws, and now we actually have an avenue in there to do that. We're now allowing Section 6 findings, which means you can ask for zoning relief on non-conforming buildings. And I think we studied that a little bit further and got the other boards knowledgeable about its effect on preserving historic structures that might work to solve zoning issues on existing buildings.
Thank you.
Good point.
Did you have a hand up? I saw your hand kind of go up. You want to add anything? One
I
last
was
comment?
debating on whether I should say anything here or not, because it probably won't be useful. But Suzanne Buchanan, 200 South Street, Hingham Historical Society Executive Director. I guess one of the things I wanted to sort of pick up on was your question to Andrea about the preservation of historic districts and the way we are thinking about historic properties here. And I just wanted to encourage, from my perspective of sort of researching Hingham's history intensively in the last 6 years, is that one of the reasons for, one of the things that we need to think about as we look at a master plan for Hingham is not so much individual historic properties and individual historic districts, but a town whose historic infrastructure is still tremendously visible in its streetscapes. And we really need to be thinking about streetscapes as opposed to individual properties. I mean, I know you have to think about individual properties. It's sort of, we're an individualistic society nowadays, but certainly we had somebody at the town meeting last fall in the debate about the field saying, well, Hingham has no corner on the market in historic buildings. But in fact, I would argue that we do, because the connectedness of our historic infrastructure is really unique. The quantity of historic buildings and their relationship to each other surviving in New England is really unique. And the documentation of those buildings and the people that lived in them and the kinds of things that they did in their day-to-day lives is tremendously unique. I've never been to a New England town, and I've been in this business for 30 years, that has had this extensive documentation and existing evidence of historic infrastructure as you walk through our streets. And I can attest sort of on some level to the fact that we just acquired from the John Richardson collection recently a wonderful ledger book from the Levitt and Rice shipping company. They had a bunch of ships at the harbor that imported, first they built ships and then they started to import things from around the world. And West India goods from the Levitt and Rice company would come into the Hingham Harbor and get transported all the way down Main Street to Alonzo Cushing's what did they call it? West Indies dry goods store on Main Street. And so those kinds of stories that we can tell about Hingham, I think, of course we can't preserve it down to the minute, but we should think about it informing our long-term planning for Hingham, because it really is a unique town in terms of the documentation and the kind of a town that it was, being a sort of a small day-to-day working town. It wasn't a glamorous town. It wasn't Salem with the East India trade, and it wasn't, with the China trade, and it wasn't Newport with the slave trade. It was just a small, working New England town, primarily farmers, primarily coopers, the sort of the bread and butter of building the American democracy. So I think those are issues that should be thought about just in terms of Hingham in its totality as a historic town. So I went on there too long, but
Nice and said.
All right, well, thank you to everyone who participated. Please stick around. We're going to continue our discussion with recreation and open space. I'm going to turn it over to Joan Blosky to facilitate.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to sort of set the stage. I have actually written about 12 open space and recreation plans that meet the state's guidelines. I've also reviewed literally hundreds over the years that come into our office. So I'm very familiar with sort of the scope and breadth and depth of open space and recreation plans. This is a little different because this is not just thinking about open space and recreation in terms of a plan that meets state guidelines. It's more integrated into everything else that you're doing. So that's very similar issues, but I think the integration of it is a very important aspect to bear in mind. How does open space and recreation fit in with all the other subjects that are in that master plan or in the summary? So I want to keep this pretty open-ended as we have with the earlier section, but just to quickly review the open space and recreation recommendations from that master plan summary. And the first one is link open space parcels to form a greenway or open space network. And this is usually done from a perspective of trails and opportunities for people to walk as well as wildlife corridors very frequently. Require that all new development include adequate and accessible open space. Increase public access to and use of existing open space areas within Hingham. So when I review or open space plans or work with communities, sometimes one of the most common things we discover is that there's a lot of open space and conservation land. Residents don't really know that it's there. It's either not signed, or there tends to be a handful of very popular areas that get heavily used and others that just aren't well known. Provide sufficient open space resources for all neighborhoods in the town of Hingham. One of the common trends is you shouldn't really have to drive to get recreation. You should have some kind of park. Even if it's just a small neighborhood park within walking distance, and this is particularly important for young children. But then there'll be other types of parks that you may need to have more centralized, larger facilities. And then the fifth one under open space was the Conservation Commission, Open Space Committee, and Community Preservation Committee should work together to increase the amount of permanently protected open space in Hingham. And then going on to recreation, and very often when you have a public meeting on the open space and recreation plan, you got two very distinct camps coming to discuss the issues. Continue to expand recreational opportunities on a town-wide basis. Seek new park and playground sites for underserved and densely populated neighborhoods. Improve access to existing facilities through appropriate signage and parking, and this gets back to the earlier, people just don't know or they can't get to these properties. Earmark funding to improve maintenance at existing recreational facilities. I very often hear in communities a reluctance to acquire any additional land because the community's having trouble maintaining what they already have. Improve coordination and cooperation between the various organizations that use, manage, and maintain recreational facilities. And in many communities, there's multiple agencies and overlapping jurisdictions, and that can create a problem. And support the development of recreational facilities plan for the former depot land adjacent to Bear Cove Park. And I suspect this one's been accomplished because I've driven past Bear Cove Park, and it looks like you've got a lot of facilities there. So I suspect number 6 is one of your successes. So I just want to open it up and just, what are, on your mind, the most important issues in either open space and recreation, or how open space and recreation might relate to some of the other issues we've discussed tonight? Come up to the mic.
Good evening. Mark Thorell, Director of Recreation, Town of Hingham. Represent the Recreation Commission. And as was laid out in the 2002 plan, the Rec Commission feels that many of the recommendations have been accomplished, including the first one, continue to expand recreational opportunities on a town-wide basis. Just in the last 5 years, the Carlson Fields were constructed with a skateboard park, basketball courts, a softball field, a Little League diamond, and 2 or 3, depending on how you break it up, multi-purpose fields. Lynch fields were constructed on Beale Street, which is shared between Little League and youth football. And then Margaret's Field 2 was constructed on Ward Street, which is primarily used as a second lacrosse field. Seek new park and playground sites for underserved and densely populated neighborhoods. With some of the loosening legislation from Community Preservation Act, they've been a great help. And just this past year, we sought and were awarded funding for a new neighborhood playground in Bradley Woods. So many of these points we feel like have been accomplished. A couple have not, and I think the strongest point that the Rec Commission would like to see an improvement on is improved coordination and cooperation between the various organizations that use, manage, and maintain recreation facilities. And certainly highly recommend that being on the next master plan. And the Rec Commission strongly believes that being the Rec Commission and the Rec Department and a town-based organization, that services can be more streamlined and maintenance can be preserved by kind of putting everything under one roof, rather than whether it's leasing out town athletic fields to nonprofits or having the selectmen manage some athletic fields, the Rec Commission, the school department. So one way or the other, just streamlining services. So we're open to discussion to further that point, in the next several months or next year with this construction of the master plan. So.
Can I ask you a question? There's been talk, and I don't have a position on this, so I don't feel like it's a sensitive question, but you let me know if it is. There's been talk about the parking at Town Hall and how sometimes during the day it becomes a big problem, and that some of that might be alleviated if the recreational uses actually in the building were moved to a different site, like the country club I heard at one point, or the school depot, kind of a building over there. Is that something you guys have talked about, or is it something that you just don't think is appropriate, or?
Yeah, no, I've heard that as well over the last 10 years. At first it was talk about the country club, and then last couple of years was talk about the building next to the Carlson Fields. Right. Not really sure where it stands now. Some years I feel like it's hotter than other years. Seems like it's been pushed back to burner a little bit. I think, to be honest with you, the Rec Commission has, just from taking a look at that building and to get that into usable shape for programs and recreational needs, I think you're looking at several $1 million to upgrade that building, and I just don't think we think it's that feasible when it doesn't cost the taxpayers anything when we're already in the building. That's great for our needs. So.
And Judy, to your point, I would also say there's a town hall study committee right now that's looking at town hall facilities and needs and opportunities and issues. The senior center is also having some space demands and parking concerns here, and is in the process of saying, is there additional space here that we could use, or do we need to find another location? And for the seniors, there's a great sense of security being here. It's a, you know, familiar location. The police are here. They have a good facility now. They just need more space. So the question of who's actually in town hall with all of our departments and who needs more space and kind of what to do about it is being looked at now. The committee just formed, so they're having their first few meetings. And my understanding is they're working closely with REC and the senior center to take a look at that.
Mark, I would agree with you that the rec department's made tremendous strides over the last couple of years in terms of the activity you cited. When I was on the rec commission, we had dedicated DPW assets. We actually had a couple DPW employees that were dedicated strictly to the rec commission. I remember when they were reassigned, as commissioners, we were a little upset about it because we didn't feel like we had the direct support that we needed for our fields and facilities. How do you talked about coordination between the different departments. Is this something you'd like to see that we should go back to, or do you feel like you're getting enough support the way it's currently structured?
I understand the question. I think the youth leagues who use our fields understand what we're dealing with, so they understand that they're going to be the ones who have to fund the maintenance of the fields. So they've actually been pretty good when their user fees changed and kind of reflected the environment that we're in. So we've been able to show that we've been able to manage 12 to 15 different athletic fields at zero cost to the taxpayer, with the exception of some fields are cut by DPW, other fields are cut by the South Shore Country Club and maintained by them. So it kind of depends on which field. This kind of goes back to that it is a big hodgepodge on which field, on which organization is doing the maintenance and the lawn cutting. So yes, to answer your question, we have been able to not rely on tax dollars of DPW and had to change the pricing structure on the users of the field, and they've been fine with that.
I had a question for you on Bradley Woods Field. Is there an opportunity or is there an option to rebuild the baseball field up there at that field? I know there's the recent CPC funding is for the playground area on the southern side of the field. Is there an opportunity to do more with that, with the baseball field?
Yes, Bradley Woods Field it certainly could be turned into a baseball diamond. We do have quite a few Little League fields in town now. Some of our other fields, like Crest Field and on Upper Gardner Street and Powers Field and Hingham Center, are used but aren't maxed out to play. So I feel like if we're going to invest into a baseball field there, I probably want to see the usage at some of those other fields get maxed out before we move there.
Okay.
So what's the biggest need in Hingham for recreation that you think maybe you're not able to fill right now, that you'd like to see more capacity?
I think just in general terms, nothing specific, but I think just in general terms, the Rec Commission views itself as what should be the town leader with recreation in general, and would hope to see in the future that the town's recreational assets be put under the management or the control of the Rec Commission for going back to the streamline of services and being easier for the residents of Hingham to understand, okay, all I have to do is go to the rec department to permit a ball field.
But is there, how do you work, say, with the senior center? Maybe because we saw in our last master plan update forum that the population in Hingham is aging along with the rest of the country. So I hear a lot about the Little League fields and the baseball diamonds and the soccer fields and the lights at the high school and all of that. But what kind of recreation facilities for the older population do you see maybe expanding or improving in the next 10 or 20 years?
But certainly have a conversation with Barbara Farnsworth about that to see what she thinks would be a good idea for the next 10 years. But we certainly have our fair share of adult leagues in terms of soccer, using the field out behind Town Hall, both men and women, and working with the youth leagues. We're able to get them all the time that they need as well. But we certainly have a conversation with Barbara to see what her needs are.
I guess I'm thinking about like walking trails or stuff like that. In a lot of towns, it's really popular to have kind of measured walking areas, and they seem pretty popular with an older population that wants to go walk 1 mile or 2 miles or 3 miles or something, you know, in a scenic area. Barefoot Park seems to have that now, but are there other areas in town that could have resources like that for, you know?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of areas in towns that are like that. But a lot of what's under the jurisdiction of the Rec Commission are the athletic fields, where some of the other parks and leisure recreational activities are under different committees and departments. So yeah. I'm sure there's a lot of great opportunities there that could be explored.
One of the field areas that I see used by a lot of senior citizens are the tennis courts, something you can play late into years. And I'm just wondering, is there any plan for refurbishing the tennis courts either behind this building or the ones at the middle school or other areas in the town?
Sure. The ones behind this building were actually redone just a couple of years ago, and they're in pretty good shape. The ones at Plymouth River are in great shape. And I believe the ones at the middle school, I think, are going to be redone after the construction of the school.
As part of that project?
Yeah, as part of the project. I believe that's the case. So, yeah, in Hingham, there's quite a few tennis courts, and Capital Outlay's done a great job with putting money into getting them resurfaced.
But again, that's not run by the recreation. You know, I know that some of those tennis courts belong to the schools and some belong to...
Plymouth River tennis courts are actually under our discretion, and the ones out here, and then other ones aren't.
Yeah.
Interesting. I think we're good.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Could we go to the question on interconnection of the conservation lands and the passive recreational resources that we have? At one point, I thought there was a map that showed all of the current conservation lands that were openly accessible. I don't know if, is that a reality, a map of those, so people know where they are? And
Hingham Land Trust puts that out.
Has that map?
Yeah.
That's where I saw that map from.
Okay.
So would everything that we recently purchased from with CPC funds be on that map?
I'm not certain on that map. I know that we're working to develop a usable GIS, and this map here, anything that has a color is a conservation or recreation parcel shown, and the ownership ranges from the rec department or the school or the town or conservation. And so we're working to have a workable, up-to-date map that the town can be responsible for keeping up to date as we acquire parcels, either through easement or fee simple. And I will also tell you that the Conservation Department has on their agenda developing land management plans for some of these open space resources. I did hear input from Barbara Farnsworth as well as from the Senior Center that one of the few things that elderly people can do is walk. But if it's a hostile pedestrian environment, or if the sidewalks are uneven and there's not a perception of safety, seniors are less likely to walk, and then they become more isolated. And so you're right on point with asking, do we need to have more walking paths? I think that if you had a number of senior citizens in the room, they would say yes, or at least a sidewalk that I feel that I can walk down without having cars go 50 miles per hour right next to me. You know, what happened to that green strip between the road and the sidewalk?
What I was thinking about is, you know, we just recently acquired 0 Scotland Street, and that connects the Marianas 28 acres to the old Marianas Farm, which is 1129 Main Street. It's obvious that there's conservation land there because there's a sign, but there really isn't any place to park to access it unless you want to park on the shoulder. I don't think it's obvious to people who don't live in that area of Hingham just how interconnected that all is. It goes all the way down to Grove Street in Norwell. You can walk 5 miles and not see a house, and it's right in the lowlands there where all the beaver dams and things. 0 Scotland Street was a meadow. It hasn't been maintained in a long time, so now it's transitioning into a scrub forest, and I'm wondering, in its beauty is as a meadow, is there a plan, is part of the management plan, is there a mowing plan where it can continue to be a meadow so that you can enjoy it? I'm also thinking of ticks and, you know, the other things that happen in the overgrowth, and a lot of people don't use that area because they're afraid of ticks and other kinds of things because it isn't mowed. And also it connects to the older conservation land that the town bought 20 years ago by the firing range. It's just it's a beautiful area that if you know it and you walk it, but if you don't know it, if you don't live there, you don't really know that it's there. And is that part of our management plan?
I will look into your specific question about the mowing with that parcel, with the management plan. I will tell you that although we have a lot of holdings, we're just now catching up to speed with developing land management plans, and one of our tasks over the next year within conservation is to do a better job of marketing the open space that we have and how do you access it. Now, there may be barriers or obstacles to creating parking lots everywhere. Sure. Certainly, I mean, that's difficult. However, for staff's part, we are working to develop mapping and trail mapping, and we also would like to come up with smartphone apps for self-guided walks along the trails, and I'm hopeful that whatever model we develop for the open space walking, we can also use for self-guided historic walking tours. Now that's a little down the road, but the GIS mapping on our website, doing a better job of advertising what we have and helping people understand the diversity of open space opportunities within the town is something that we can do. It's just an opportunity cost within, you know, staffing and permitting and technology. But certainly we're working on it, and if there's support for efforts like those, then we would continue doing that type of work.
Have you spoken to the people at the Hingham Land Trust, Kathy?
Reardon?
I have not.
They have a great map of all the open space in Hingham and how it's accessed. And I don't know if it's been updated, but it's a lot of work went into that.
I just wanted to let people know that MAPC has developed I'm not sure what the app is called, but it's a Boston green space, Boston and several of the surrounding communities, and it could be a prototype. I don't think it's as focused on walking routes, but it's an app that you can find what are the available conservation lands and parklands in a community and what facilities are there. So I'll try to get a link to it or get it on Mary's phone so that you can maybe take a look at it someday, because I think it might be exactly what you're talking about.
Is that proprietary?
A couple of hands back there. Way in the back. You haven't spoken up. You want to come up?
No, I think, yeah.
Vicki?
Thank you. Vicki Donlin, the newest elected Hingham Rec Commissioner. I just, having gotten up to speed now that I'm on the Rec Center, I just wanted to make sure that this committee understood that when you were talking to Mark about recreational facilities in town, so many of the recreational facilities aren't under the Rec Commission. For example, the driving range. Obviously, golf, I would think, would be recreational. I don't understand why it's not under the Rec Center. The bathing beach, we've talked a lot about great senior programs could be at the bathing beach. What a wonderful, very safe place, lots of parking. But we can't talk about that because the bathing beach isn't under the Recreation Commission. So I would hope with a master plan that a real strong look would be taken at what is under recreation and what isn't, so that we can really do our job. I mean, obviously the country club is not under Recreation Commission, and you know, it is recreational facilities. So whether there was some way to have umbrella groups, but understanding that when we're talking about recreation, and back to the question about who mows lawns, wouldn't it be wonderful if all the lawns were being mowed and efficiently mainstreamed so that we could be getting the best bang for the buck? So having everything coordinated under one department certainly to me would make great sense. And of course it's just come to my now being new on the committee, so I just want to make sure that as you do a master plan, that really understanding the management would really help us. Walking trails, I can't imagine the bathing beach being better for seniors. One of the first things I said, why aren't we getting seniors over to the bathing beach? Thank you.
Thanks, Vicki.
Jim?
I worked a bit on updating the open space plan a couple of years ago, and we put in some references to, for example, having an exercise circuit at a playground, so that while you're watching your kids, you can do the circuit. People of any age, grandparents. And just a small thing, but I think the idea somebody just mentioned of a series of trails of different lengths, mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, beginning and ending at a predictable spot, makes a lot of sense, because people want to know what they're getting themselves into. Mm-hmm. In terms of connections, I think a major, is this actually on?
Yes, for the television viewer.
Okay, because actually it's very hard to hear from the audience. Anyway, something I've been thinking about, working with some people, is to get a connection between Great Esker Park and Bear Cove, because you can go the length of Great Esker in Weymouth and turn around and go back. Whereas in Bear Cove, we have a lot of loops that you can do various things. So the thought is to get a footbridge, like the one at Sandwich, between the two. Anyway, that's the thing. Alan's been giving some good technical advice on. The third thing that I think people of all ages like is gardening. And a lot of people have yards that are ledgy, or overshaded, or too small, or something. And we put in the plan various areas suggested for community gardens. And it turned out that the best one physically was in Monte Meadow. And we were working on it, and it turned out there was an agreement that nobody on the Conservation Commission knew about, except somebody who wasn't at the meeting where they voted for it, which was not to have any use of the land. And there's some feeling now that the family will soften that over time. But it was very sad, because there's a piece of land, low, moist, sunny, accessible, very near my house, a lot of good features. And we thought we had it. But I would keep that in as a possibility, particularly even on the edges of some of the playgrounds. There's a strip that's sunny and clear and under surveillance, so there won't be much mischief. Anyway, those are two things, I think, the walking and the gardening, and connecting the major intertown facilities. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim.
Well, Alan's walking up. I just wanted to say, Jim, there is somebody in town who met with me and Mary about a month or two ago who's very interested in connecting our open space assets with either bike paths or walking trails or something. So looking at the map and saying, oh my gosh, you could park here and you can actually get, like Gary was saying, from this to the other thing.
The other thing I should have mentioned, I think you mentioned in passing, is the so-called parklands republic map that the land trust has been putting out for 30 years. And we're very open to corrections and suggestions. And it does have a lot of information on the back side. It's not posted here. It doesn't break it up by ownership. It shows what it is and where it is.
But it's pretty complete. Yeah.
I took a lot of notes on a lot of these subjects. I'm a big open space and recreation fan. One thing on Vicki Donlan's point, though, I'll try to go from the most recent thing to whatever, to a few other specific points, is Bill was on the Harbor Planning Task Force near the end. Susan Murphy was the chairperson of that, who came from this committee. I almost wonder if there'd be some merit in having like a recreational open space task force, because I think the real plus of the Harbor Task Force is it got groups that I don't think, in most cases, I'll say, weren't intentionally not talking amongst one another. They just didn't know who the other parties were. and I'm just new to the trustees of the bathing beach, as you're new to being on the recreation committee. And I would wonder if that would be a positive thing, if you had like a Kathy Reardon and Vicky and either myself or someone else from the bathing beach trustees and the harbor master, you know, the recreation director, and you start to look at this globally, you know, so you're looking at things. I agree, you know, the map that's put out is great. Does it say where you can park, where you can't park? We did Ridgewood Crossing. We had a point of tying into Moore Brewer Park, you know. I'm not sure that's shown, however. So you could actually walk from French Street and get to, you know, to Brewer Park and Moore Brewer Park. I don't know people know that, though. And maybe just doing that, and again, kind of getting above it a little bit and looking and having a number of people who would have pertinent comments, and if you got them together, I don't think it has to work for a long time. As I always reminded Susan, we were a task force, which is how we got the advisory thing in. I said, well, I don't know if we're going to try to get it through planning board this year. I said, well, our goal is to have tasks whether we get them or not, but let's try to move the ball. And I think that would be a good, that might be a good way to deal with this, because I mean, I think there's a lot of issues linking open space, where the Bouvet parcel is a great parcel. There's like 3 parking spaces there, you know, and if you're in South Hingham, you don't know the Bouvet parcel from the South Shore Industrial Park. I mean, you know, but I think if you at least were aware, and you don't need a lot of parking spaces. If you look down the Cape where the, you know, kayak ramps and other things like that, you're talking 4 or 5. This isn't something that's going to attract 25 people at a time.
Right.
We've talked to that on the Harbor Committee as well, of not just being the inner harbor, which historically was what they looked at. Should there be a kayak launch area in Bear Cove? And again, as people are getting older, softer things to do like kayaking, biking. Are there safe areas where you could bike? And say, like, I could go Wampatuck Park, State Park. Like, should we have, you know, I think that's the most ignored resource in the town of Hingham. I don't live that far from it right now, but I think there's never been much connection between the state and the town on what is one of the largest open space areas. You can bike through it, very poorly marked. I can attest to that. I've got lost there a couple times. But it doesn't mean we can't do a better job of those things. I don't think it's that difficult, most of these things. So that would be my thought. And the one last thing I would mention, actually we are talking about maybe a playground down by the beach as well, and there's a group, the Friends of Hingham Harbor. It is part of the, when they formed the bathing beach, was also to look at the beach, but also playground activities, you know, so there isn't one. There used to be one. And again, that's a good mix, older people and younger people. As far as older people watching kids play and things like that isn't necessarily a bad mix. And you look at other places along the water, in either Fort Lauderdale or other places, that they'll have small exercise stations along the waterfront. Very simple things that, again, as you age, you can kind of do things at different spots. So it's a lot of stuff being thrown on the table, but I think it's a pretty broad thing. And looking at recreation passively and actively is a very different thing. But that they can meld with one another is a good thing. My last thing is, has anyone really looked much about the Rails to Trails, that old rail line that went from South Shore Country Club? I know there were breaks in it going to the Hingham Shipyard, but I guess that's always been, it's so successful elsewhere. Is there some way of, and even if it's not continuous, do you pick up the road for a while and then you get back on it, you know? That would almost link the commuter boat and the train station at the country club. You know, it's just a thought, and I know we're doing that Dorigo thing now, kind of crossing over it, and I'm not sure who controls it or has the rights to it, but, you know, it's been done in a lot of communities, and there's federal money to do that.
Well, and I always thought an extension of Boston's bike, you know, the bike hub thing, you know, if you took the bike to the boat and then got off at the Hingham Shipyard, shouldn't there be a bike sitting there so that you could come to a meeting at Town Hall, or go to Wampatuck or something like that? So how could we, and which one of all the recreation and open space and conservation committees and groups would undertake something like that? So I think your idea of having a big powwow and maybe coming up with some priorities and assigning
good idea.
Kind of,
I think the Harbor Task Force's greatest thing was transparency. I think, you know, the fact I sat next to Peter Fee and I didn't know Peter, you know, so I get an understanding of the trustees' issues. And then I think the selectmen get an idea of planning issues and things that, you know, okay, there's parking requirements, there's this requirement. There's like 3 or 4 different jurisdictions down by the harbor, for example. I mean, the Better Beach is not controlled by the trustees of the bathing beach. But I think just that would help immeasurably, I think, if we could ever do it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah,
So,
great idea.
So that's it.
Thanks, Alan.
Thanks.
Do we have any other comments?
Well, this has been tremendously helpful. I think we've gotten an awful lot of input tonight. I got 17 pages of notes, so.
I would just like to put one other comment out to the planning board that I've heard, so I want to repeat it in a public forum. I have had people ask me if the planning board or zoning board would be receptive to considering expanded use options for some historic properties in order to further encourage preservation. For example, if there's a very big house, right now we could have a two unit instead of a 1 unit. Is that enough to subsidize the restoration of the facade, for example? Or is there an opportunity, perhaps through a special permit or another type of, not by right, but by after careful consideration and meeting certain thresholds, are there cases where allowing that giant single-family house to become a four apartment house, if that would make it so that the house could be restored or preserved as opposed to demolished or not economically viable? Because another thing that does play into a lot of these losses of historic structures are the market. And every meeting I've gone to on master plan, I've heard concerns expressed about tear downs, and I've also heard concerns expressed about loss of our historic resources. And sometimes it's the same thing and sometimes it's not. So I put that out to the planning board to consider, and I hope that we can come back together, perhaps with the zoning board over the summer or in the early fall, and have a dialogue around bylaw changes with the public about, are any needed? If so, what might they be? And that's...
Sounds like an interesting one.
Yeah, it'd be a good discussion.
Right. That's... Does anyone else have anything else you'd like to add? So I would thank everybody for their input and turn it back over to Bill.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for coming tonight, everybody. We appreciate it. It's a good discussion.